Welcome to the English Department Colloquium Series. My name is Skip Willman, and I am the coordinator of graduate studies in the department. And it is my pleasure today to introduce Dr. Ben Hagen. Dr. Hagen received his PhD from the University of Rhode Island in 2012. His research interests include modern and contemporary literature, particularly the work of Virginia Woolf and D.H. Lawrence, continental philosophy, the history of criticism and theory, and affect love studies. He has published extensively on the work of Virginia Woolf, with essays appearing in collections from Edinburgh University Press and Bloomsbury Academic, as well as the real cool PMLA, with an essay entitled Feeling Shadows, Virginia Woolf's Sensuous Pedagogy. Speaking of Virginia Woolf, Dr. Hagen will be organizing the 2020 Virginia Woolf International Conference to be hosted by USD in the summer of 2020. So kudos to you, my friend, and my sincere sympathies. It's going to be a load of work. Since his arrival at USD 3 years ago, Dr. Hagen has contributed mightily to the department, and I would highlight his role, for instance, in spearheading our theory reading group as one notable example. His insights into the work of Gil Deleuze, Michel Foucault, Judith Butler, and Jonathan Lear have really helped the whole crew digest this difficult material. Dr. Hagen is currently working on a research project entitled The Sensuous Pedagogies of Virginia Woolf and D.H. Lawrence. Today his lecture is entitled Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway, Form Life Critique. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Ben Hagen.
I apologize if this isn't super coherent, since most of it was written cards on the table yesterday. So we'll see how it goes. So part one, a polemical introduction. Literary historians typically categorize Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway as a modernist novel. What does this mean? For a critic and historian like Stephen Kern, this means that it belongs to a category of long fiction, written by novelists who were responsive to revolutionary developments in science and the arts between 1900 and 1940. These developments include the rediscovery of Gregor Mendel's revolution in our knowledge of hereditary transmission, laying the foundation for modern scientific genetics. They include Sigmund Freud's theory of the mind as a network of unconscious processes and the residue of childhood psychosexual experiences. Also, Planck's constant, a key to understanding the spectra of thermal bodies that became the first blow in a series of advances that led to a fully elaborated quantum theory, including the probabilistic basis of the indeterminacy principle, informing our limited knowledge of subatomic events. Also, Albert Einstein, his intervention in our understanding of the shape of space and time, both of which, as he theorized, are relative to motion and transform into each other. In this context, rife with scientific developments that alter intellectual holds on our world and ourselves, Kern sees undeniable ties to the music of Arnold Schoenberg, which lacked a sensible tonal center, and the visual compositions of Wassily Kandinsky, which captivatingly refused to portray recognizable objects. Here's just one of Kandinsky's 1911 paintings, Composition 4, which also happens to be on the cover of Kern's book. No single literary change, Kern claims, was as revolutionary as these objects. However, the sum of formal innovations in the novel was revolutionary, he argues, in providing new ways of rendering how people experience personal development, courtship conventions, family relations, urban life, national identification, imperial conquest, capitalist enterprise, liberal institutions, religious faith, and artistic creativity. These innovations, in short, had a tremendous impact on what novels could convey. And they did so, Kern's introductory text shows, by experimenting with the most elemental components of fiction: character, event, space, time, framework, text, and narrative. These novels, for instance, all have characters. They're all modernist novels. They all have characters, of course. They all present events that occur in space and time, though they are not always causally linked with each other. They all obviously begin and end, all have a narrator that directs or misleads us. But how the novels I picture here present these elements would have a lasting effect, or so the story goes, on how we read, write, and study literary fiction in the 21st century. Of course, there are other lesser known, but not lesser venerable modernist texts, some more difficult to obtain than others. Now, I'm going to apologize ahead of time, Skip, for the next few minutes, so just one point. Now, we've heard a bit about modernism in previous colloquium lectures this fall, namely in Dr. Willman's lecture, when we learned about magical realism, historiographic metafiction, and postmodernism, as well as Dr. McCormick's lecture, which also adopted the term historiographic metafiction. Though everyone here might not have attended both of those lectures, I want to begin with a polemical response, neither to the lectures themselves nor to my wonderful colleagues who are great, or even to the texts that they analyze, but rather to the kind of modernism I come up against when I read Linda Hutcheon, whose work both Dr. Willman and Dr. McCormick cited, as they should have. These two works of criticism are seminal texts in late 20th century literary criticism and history. But to my mind, Hutcheon builds her definition of postmodernism and its poetics or politics by flattening the literary history of the 19th and early to mid-20th centuries, stripping it of its variety, reducing the authors and texts of both realism and modernism to gross generalities, and thus consolidating for herself and her subfield a stable ground in an era of supposed instability. For theorists of postmodernism like Hutcheon, literary modernism entails all kinds of problematic postures and naive intentions that writers of the mid to late 20th century somehow managed to mitigate or correct. For example, apolitical withdrawal into art for art's sake safe spaces. We might think of James Joyce's self-exile to Europe, avoiding the fraught politics of his Irish homeland, and giving himself the breathing room necessary to write all of his major work. This is a statue of Joyce you can still go visit in Italy. This is probably the most famous photograph of Joyce, which was taken in Paris. These modernist postures also include nostalgic hand-wringing among the fragments of a past from which artists feel alienated, as seen perhaps in T.S. Eliot's maze of illusions in his 1922 poem, The Wasteland. Or a heroic desire to affirm the formal, aesthetic autonomy of art from the impurities of society, politics, or history, to overcome nostalgia, in other words, and to make it new, no matter reading publics with limited access to the cultural capital needed to interpret formal experiments or obnoxious masturbatory displays of linguistic hedonism. I'm thinking particularly of the two major modernist works that very few people can actually read, James Joyce's Finnegan's Wake and Ezra Pound's Cantos. To illustrate the supposed modernist principle of ideal of aesthetic autonomy or self-sufficiency, that is, the freedom of art from the demands of the social, political, or historical, critics have often cited the character Stephen Dedalus in Joyce's novel, A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, especially this passage. This is the character Stephen Dedalus talking to a friend of his. Quote, "The artist, like the god of the creation, remains within or behind or beyond or above his handiwork, invisible, refined out of existence, indifferent, paring his fingernails. But the artist must also have their freedom." Quote, "When the soul of a man," this is also Stephen talking to another friend, "is born in this country, Ireland, there are nets flung at it to hold it back from flight. You talk to me of nationality, language, religion. I shall try to fly by those nets." At the end of the novel, Stephen is perched ready for this heroic flight to the continent of Europe, a flight from Catholicism and Irish politics and nationalism, writing in his journal, this is probably the most famous passage in the novel, "Welcome, O life. I go to encounter for the millionth time the reality of experience, and to forge in the smithy of my soul the uncreated conscience of my race." But a definition of modernism that takes passages like these as foundational statements rather than the awkwardly confident aesthetic theorizing of a fictional young man who utterly fails to become the hero he imagines, which is what happens to Stephen Willis. This is not descriptive, but pejoratively normative. Indeed, the modernism that Hutchins' definition of postmodernism requires is selective and exclusionary. It's also masculine. The movement of the men of 1914, we see here Ezra Pound, James Joyce, T.S. Eliot, and the wicked grin of Wyndham Lewis's self-portrait in the background. It's not, at least not by the estimation of most modernist scholars these days, the modernism of the women of 1928. We see here Rebecca West, Virginia Woolf, and Juna Barnes. And Hutchins' picture of modernism is certainly not this modernism. The transatlantic and global networks forged in small periodicals, through correspondence, small press publishing, reviewing, radio, and other communication technologies, collaboration and competition, much of it engaged socially, historically, and politically. A more balanced approach to investigating postmodern and contemporary literature's relation to modernism might note Derek Walcott's admitted debt to William Butler Yeats and even Joyce, caught as the latter two were between a love of their homeland, Ireland, and the English language. A fraught position Walcott also explores across his oeuvre, for instance in the widely anthologized poem A Far Cry from Africa, and in his book-length poem, Omeros, which directly cites both of these figures. But there's also Jeanette Winterson, Zadie Smith, Alan Hollinghurst, Carol Naso, and Carol Phillips, who all, among others, resonate with the modernism of Woolf, Jean Rhys, and Ian Forster, again, among others. Before I turn to Mrs. Dalloway, I want to ramp up my polemic just a little bit. The common definition of postmodernism is a radical suspicion of all grand or meta-narratives, a definition that has the gravitas of French theory, which we've also heard something about in previous colloquium lectures, and with good reason, because it's a seminal definition, always calls up for me another term from French theory, the Lacanian mirror stage. If you don't know the Lacanian mirror stage, it's going to be real quick, so don't worry. I'll get through it real quick. I want you to imagine the moment postmodernism's parent holds it up to a mirror. And for the first time, baby postmodernism recognizes itself, identifying itself with the flat reflection that gives it an illusion of fullness. And it spends the rest of its life failing to live up to the promise of that image's coherence. When we reproduce the incredulity of meta-narrative's definition of postmodernism, all the while predicating it on a reified and stabilized category of modernism and realism, we reinforce the grand narrative of our own that goes by the seemingly benign name, literary history. Missed a few slides, sorry. They weren't important, it was just a blank one, and this one. This is to say that postmodernism's coherence relies on a story, at the end of which it positions itself. A story, that is, of how we got here, that begins with the ancients, slips by the Dark Ages, better left to medievalists, finally becomes modern on or around the writing of Hamlet, skips through a field of daffodils with William Wordsworth in defiance of Alexander Pope's great chain of being, grows grouchy and strict and reserved under the reign of Queen Victoria, acts out self-indulgently after decades of repression following the Queen's death, that would be modernism, and only after fighting a few world wars, dropping the atomic bomb, granting colonies their independence, and taking capitalism global, finally gets it right with The End of the Road by John Barth in 1958. Or is it Graduate Rainbow in 1973? Or is it White Noise in 1985? Or is it Infinite Jest in 1996? By the way, I love all of these novels, so this is not a criticism of these novels. What I want to call postmodernism, Hutchins writes, is fundamentally contradictory, resolutely historical, and inescapably political. Not a nostalgic return, but a critical revisiting, an ironic dialogue with the past of both art and society. To me, this is a maddening quotation, insofar as each and every one of these features that Hutchins wants to earmark for postmodernism clearly marks earlier literary periods too. More than that, the snide qualification, not a nostalgic return, betrays the pejorative sense in which she understands modernism. We might paraphrase her as saying, this is incredibly ungenerous, just so you know. Down with the transparent referentiality of realists, those poor fools who think so linearly and simply. And down with the nostalgic and naive nerds of modernism, those snobs who impotently strive to break from the past with the somber angularity of their architecture, the amorphous bodies and skewed and spiraled landscapes of their visual art, the cringing atonality of their music, if we can call it music, and the fragmented incomprehensibility of their exhausting literature. In my view, Hutchins' desire to capture postmodernism at the expense of realism and modernism requires and reinforces the violent meta-narrative that has traditionally structured English departments, shaped expectations of how we should become an expert or a generalist in literary studies, predetermined reading lists and curricula, and laid the groundwork where becoming a specialist in one era often meant finding the literature of other eras horribly naive. Modernist scholars like myself are not immune to the convenience of this meta-narrative, and you may hear a little bit of this as I move into my talk on Mrs. Dalloway. We still tell ourselves sometimes that Victorian realist fiction is horribly straightforward, and thus must obviously be less interesting than the cutting-edge free indirect discourse of Catherine Mansfield or Virginia Woolf. I'm going to turn to Mrs. Dalloway, I promise. I'm almost done with this. But I should clarify that my intention in the opening polemic against Hutchins echoes an ongoing concern with the largely unquestioned dominance of literary period as the primary organizing concept of our discipline. Perhaps its time as native and post-colonial theorists as well as comparativists have been imploring for some time, that we start considering what it might mean to join them in dismantling the grand march of literary periods. Part 2, form. So I've probably gotten carried away. Modernist literature often is, after all, preoccupied with all sorts of formal experimentation that may, indeed, evince a desire to withdraw from the much messier concerns of some Victorian literature, which addressed issues like child labor and poverty and oppressive working conditions, and an equal desire to secure oneself, the artist, in a zone where the only concern is the art for the sake of the art itself. I'll come back around to the question of Woolf in something like politics in the last section of my talk. But it is undeniable that one of her primary preoccupations was the art of the novel. How to make one, how to shape one, how to do one differently, even to the point of rendering the term novel obsolete, which is somewhat ironic, since if we turn novel into an adjective, it means innovative, new. Mrs. Dalloway is a challenging book to read for many reasons, and I have a feeling many of you in this room are reading it or just finished reading it. Many of them having to do with the basic elements of fiction. There's not really a plot, after all, in the sense that there are very few events. And these events don't really shape themselves into a clear cause and effect sequence. In the first section, for instance, Clarissa Dalloway walks to Bond Street, a shopping district of London, to buy flowers for a large party she will be hosting that same evening. At the end of the section, she makes it to the flower shop, buys a bunch of flowers. A motor car outside the flower shop backfires, drawing the attention in the following section not only of Clarissa Dalloway, but of a whole crowd of shoppers and pedestrians who spend the next few minutes wondering who might be in the car. One of these onlookers is Septimus Smith, a 30-year-old veteran of the Great War, suffering daily and hourly from post-traumatic stress. But the second section of the novel does not really focus on Septimus. Rather, it attends to the crowd, fascinated by the motor car, and later distracted by a skywriting airplane circulating over the voices of minor characters whom we will never hear from again. Eventually, Woolf jump cuts back to Clarissa Dalloway, Mrs. Dalloway, who returns home and is visited unexpectedly by Peter Walsh, a man whom she had considered marrying 3 decades earlier, and whom she had already been thinking about since the very first page of the novel. They talk awkwardly with one another. Peter starts crying. One of the most delicious scenes of man pain you'll ever see. Clarissa's daughter enters the room, and Peter marches away quickly, out of embarrassment, called after by Clarissa, who implores him to come to her party. After he wakes up, he walks over 2 miles to Regent's Park and falls asleep on a bench. After he wakes up, the narrator eventually returns to Septimus Smith and his wife, Rezia. In subsequent questions, we also meet William Dr. William Bradshaw, a psychologist with whom the Smiths have an appointment that same day, Richard Dalloway, Clarissa's husband, as well as Miss Kilman, the tutor of the Dalloway's daughter, Elizabeth. But none of the events of the novel have a direct cause and effect relation to one another, or they don't seem to. Clarissa's walk to the flower shop does not really do anything. She hears the motor car backfire, but she has nothing to do with it, and makes it back home in time for Peter's unexpected visit. Peter and Septimus occupy the same park at the same time, but they don't talk with each other, because they don't know each other. Richard Dalloway, he overhears at lunch that Peter Walsh is back in town, and rushes home with newly purchased flowers of his own to tell Clarissa he loves her. But he fails to tell her, just giving her the flowers and suggesting that she take a nap, since she's recently been home. Well, there are other reasons than that, but that's what he says. And though there are plenty of narrative echoes between Septimus and Clarissa, they never meet. He never thinks of her, and she only thinks of him after Dr. and Mrs. Bradshaw show up late to her party that night, delayed by the news that one of his patients, a new one, who he had just met with hours earlier, has committed suicide. The novel ends shortly thereafter, Clarissa returning from a brief seclusion, sitting in a room, thinking about the suicide of this stranger, just as Peter and Sally, another childhood friend who has reappeared in Clarissa's life in this day, were thinking of leaving. Again, outside of Septimus' death, nothing really happens in this novel, in the sense that nothing really forwards a chain of events that we might recognize to be a plot. So what matters to Woolf? Why would we want to read this novel? One answer might be the pleasures of learning from its form what else might come to matter to us in a work of fiction, other than something that happens that then leads to something else happening. So let's start with the first page. You guys got 4 hours, right? Get through the novel. Quote, Mrs. Dalloway said she would buy the flowers herself. For Lucy had her work cut out for her. The doors would be taken off their hinges, Rumpelmayer's men were coming. And then, thought Clarissa Dalloway, what a morning. Fresh as if issued to children on a beach. What a lark, what a plunge, for so it had always seemed to her when, with a little squeak of the hinges, which she could hear now, she had burst open the French windows and plunged at Burton into the open air. How fresh, how calm, stiller than this, of course, the air was in the early morning, like the flap of a wave, the kiss of a wave, chill and sharp, and yet, for a girl of 18, as she then was, solemn, feeling as she did, standing there at the open window, that something awful was about to happen. Looking at the flowers, at the trees with the smoke winding off them, and the roofs rising, falling, standing and looking until Peter Walsh said, musing among the vegetables? Is that it? I prefer men to cauliflowers. Is that it? He must have said it at breakfast one morning when she had gone out on the terrace. Peter Walsh. He would be back from India one of these days, June or July, she forgot which. For his letters were awfully dull. It was his sayings one remembered. His eyes, his pocket knife, his smile, his grumpiness, and when millions of things had utterly vanished, how strange it was. A few sayings like this about cabbages. On a first read, I think I need 4 hands to tell you how many times I've read this novel, so it's hard for me to go back and remember what it was like to experience this page for the first time, but I imagine that it's somewhat confusing. But on a careful rereading, you see that the narrative voice carefully controls this presentation of Clarissa Dalloway's thoughts and feelings. Signposts like these distinguish the narrator's voice from Clarissa's expressions, but Woolf signposts a good deal more. As James Narramore puts it, and I'll be sort of following Narramore's analysis of this page for the next few minutes, as James Narramore puts it, quote, Woolf wants to make it clear that Clarissa Dalloway's thoughts are the subject of this first page. She wants to offer a suggestion of the exterior surroundings. A lady with a servant girl, the lady stepping out of her door on a fresh morning, and to distinguish reverie from the here and now, past and present. The technique, he claims, is economical and unobstructive. This is me now. And yet, while the narrative technique we see masterfully deployed here may seem unobstructive in the sense that Stephen Dedalus gives it in A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, the thoughts of Clarissa, which the first 15 pages or so present to us, are heavily ordered and rhythmic. As Naramore puts it, not even the literary Hamlet-esque young Dedalus in Ulysses thinks in such beautifully modulated, periodic sentences. Indeed, the first page does not merely present ideas as they occur to Clarissa. This is not a stream of consciousness, in the sense literally meant, a transcription of thought, but a carefully constructed cluster of sentences that mediate and translate thought and feeling. As Clarissa falls into a daydream of her teenage years at Burton, teased by Peter Walsh for her love of solitude, Naramore argues, the sentence is drawn out by the addition of participle phrases, which create a flow of impressions and help measure out a rhythm. Other repetitions, together with several of the important words and images, help induce a dreamy effect. This effect is all the more interesting for the way it differs from the light, bustling mood established at its start. As Clarissa makes her way toward the flower shop, the narrator, with occasional deviations, continues to center the thought of the novel's protagonist as the primary subject of the first section. Though the narrator marks her progress by noting streets and parks, these signposts are easy to miss, crowded out by Mrs. Dalloway's thoughts on the war, that is the Great War, World War I, which is just, well, the novel takes place in 1923, so it's been over for half a decade. Her thoughts on the war, on the busy life of the city, on the pleasures of throwing a party, on her continued annoyance even after 30 years with Peter, who had once or continually teased her about growing up to be a perfect hostess, on her decision to marry Richard instead of Peter, on her own, quote, gift of knowing people almost by instinct, and of course on her atheistic consolation in the idea, quote, that death ended absolutely. Seems a morbid thing to be thinking about, going to get flowers. But that somehow in the streets of London, on the ebb and flow of things, here, there, she survived. Peter survived, lived in each other. She, being part, she was positive of the trees at home. Of the house there, ugly, rambling, all to bits and pieces. Part of people she had never met, being laid out like a mist between the people she knew best, who lifted her on their branches as she had seen the trees lift the mist, but it spread ever so far. Her life, herself. She reflects on a good deal more in these opening pages, moving back and forth between past and present, Burton, her family's country home when she was young, and London, Peter's criticism, and the sheer pleasure of playing host. The narrative management of these movements has less to do, it seems to me, as I said before, with the literal transcription of thought, and more to do with the invention of a literary technique capable of presenting the rich complexity, even contradictoriness of inner life, situating the location of a character in a clear setting, and even attending to the significance of trivialities. In her diary, Woolf refers to the dynamics of her narrative perspective as a tunneling process, by which she tells the past by installments as she has needed it. Using this process, she can dig out beautiful caves behind her characters, giving them humanity, humor, depth, even if all they do presently is walk to a flower shop. But this process does more than teach us to move as readers quickly between present and past, reality and daydream. It also becomes a technique for transitioning between characters. The squeak of the hinge on the first page inspires a narrative dynamic between past and present, but the backfiring of the motor car, which Clarissa initially hears as the shot of a pistol in the street motivates a lateral shift among numerous characters who have heard the same noise. Later in the novel, the strikes of Big Ben become the sensuous thread that the narrator rides across several districts of London, shifting between Septimus and Lucrezia, arriving at Dr. Bradshaw's office just south of Regent's Park, all the way to Clarissa continuing her party preparations in Westminster. Thus, the dynamics of the narrative point of view that Woolf invents for Mrs. Dalloway becomes a way for her to accomplish several things. Here's just a few. To center the mundane and everyday inner life of human beings as worthy of literary attention. To aestheticize this inner life by translating it into sentences capable of incredible affective and rhythmic range. To cluster together human beings who need not be near one another or even know one another in order to matter to one another. To imply thematic significance through a kind of narrative parataxis, that is, a suggestive placing of things side by side. And to invite readers to take pleasure in rereading sentences, not for the sake of finding out what happens to these characters, though there is certainly an element of mystery bound up with the odd arrangement and placement of them, but rather for the sake of the presentation itself, and for the sake of that which Virginia Woolf sees as the central mission of fiction, the conveyance of life. When she criticizes other novelists, for instance, it isn't because they are not experimental enough, or because they write too much like Charles Dickens, whom she admired, but because, quote, life escapes. And perhaps without life, nothing else is worthwhile. The next two sections are shorter. The writings of contemporaries, like Joyce and D.H. Lawrence, contemporaries of Woolf, interested her and also aggravated her because they seemed to come closer to life than contemporaries who focused instead on descriptive accumulations of exterior details. But what for Woolf is life? And how might we connect her experiments in narrative perspective in Mrs. Dalloway to her concept of life? Here's a passage, it's big, I apologize, from Woolf's essay Modern Fiction, published the same year as Mrs. Dalloway. Quote, you may have heard some of these sentences before. Examine for a moment an ordinary mind on an ordinary day. The mind receives a myriad impressions, trivial, fantastic, evanescent, or engraved with the sharpness of steel. From all sides they come, an incessant shower of innumerable atoms, and as they fall, as they shape themselves into the life of Monday or Tuesday, the accent falls differently from gold. The moment of importance came not here, but there, so that if a writer were a free man and not a slave, if he could write what he chose, not what he must, if he could base his work upon his own feeling and not upon convention, there would be no plot, no comedy, no tragedy, no love interest or catastrophe in the accepted style. And perhaps not a single button sewn on, as the Bond Street tailors would have them. It's an inside joke, you don't need to worry about. Life is not a series of gig lamps, symmetrically arranged, she continues. Life is a luminous halo, a semi-transparent envelope surrounding us from the beginning of consciousness to the end. Is it not the task of the novelist to convey this varying, this unknown and uncircumscribed spirit, whatever aberration or complexity it may display, with as little mixture of the alien and external as possible? The modern fiction is often read as a kind of manifesto of modernist fiction. I think we miss the point of Woolf's essay, which incorporates in other spots a good deal of qualifying language and autocritical uncertainty about the aesthetic preferences of its author, if we think it is telling us that all good fiction should look like Mrs. Dalloway. What I think is worth taking away from this passage is that Woolf distinguishes between life and plot, life and story. Life can certainly take the form of a story, but life need not be a story. At least not a series of casually linked gig lamps. Or plausibly linked, rather casually. I don't have time to get into a conceptual elaboration of what Woolf means by life here, but modern people won't ask me, I can go into it, but modern fiction might help us see that the experiments in narrative perspective in Mrs. Dalloway are not just for the art's sake, but for the sake of evoking threads of continuity between past and present, over here and over there, and Bloomsbury and Westminster, Clarissa and Septimus, the chimes of a tower bell and the squeak of a hinge, the living and the dead, all encompassed by an envelope or halo. It's a computer-generated model of names, connections, encounters, locations in the novel that was developed by researchers at the University of Victoria in British Columbia. People with larger names have the most connections, so it's no surprise that Clarissa dominates. But what's quite remarkable is that Septimus is barely visible at the top. Despite being one of the major characters in the novel, he's much more isolated than the people who exist in the same class as Clarissa. Suggesting this might visualize or illustrate something like what Woolf might mean by life. Part 4, critique. Perhaps I should start regretting my earlier blank. While Woolf's interest in life might not simply be for the sake of her art nevertheless holds a central place in how she views human beings and their living relations to each other. In the memoir she started but never finished near the end of her life, she writes, quote, "Perhaps this is the strongest pleasure known to me. It is the rapture I get when in writing I seem to be discovering what belongs to what, making a scene come right, making a character come together. From this I reach what I might call a philosophy. At any rate, it is a constant idea of mine, that behind the cotton wool of daily life is hidden a pattern. That we, I mean all human beings, are connected with this pattern. That the whole world is a work of art. That we are parts of the work of art. Hamlet, or a Beethoven quartet, is the truth about this vast mass that we call the world. But there is no Shakespeare. There is no Beethoven. Certainly and emphatically, there is no God. We are the words. We are the music. We are the thing itself." On first blush, this passage might suggest I am in trouble, since it, again on first blush, seems to promote some sort of radical apolitics, or a radically apolitical view of art. These appear like the musings of an artist resting in the safe space of Bloomsbury. This first blush would certainly correspond to the early reception history of Woolf, reinforced by her family and friends, that she was, in her own husband's words, quote, "the least political animal that has lived since Aristotle invented the definition," end quote. But then again, if the purpose of the technique she invents in Mrs. Dalloway is to make a vital connection between spaces, times, and human beings perceptible to us as readers, we might ask what we make of these connections. Why make a connection between Clarissa and Septimus? Why chain together the various thoughts sweeping Clarissa toward Bond Street? What becomes visible if we see human beings as the thing itself? Instead of surveying the enormous body of secondary literature dedicated to this novel, which shows how Mrs. Dalloway formally addresses the fallout of World War I, the institutional function of medical power and knowledge, social class, sexuality, what we might now call toxic masculinity and reproductive heteronormativity, fashion and consumerism, and so on, I want to conclude with a single moment from early in the novel, a later atom that descends on Clarissa as we move with her through the opening section. I hope to show, though I might not have time to convince you, that the aesthetic experiment Woolf runs in Mrs. Dalloway, the modulation of narrative perspective to economically establish a variety of temporal, spatial, and psychological connections, is also a method of critique, a literary method of exposing the psychic life of power, as well as micro-political threats to life that go unnoticed by most of the characters in this novel, but which are available to those of us who learn to read it. Elsewhere in her diary, Woolf writes of Mrs. Dalloway, "In this book, I have almost too many ideas. I want to give life and death, sanity and insanity, I want to criticize the social system and to show it at work at its most intense. What might it mean for a novel relentlessly focused on the inner life to simultaneously criticize the social system? Where is the social system at work at its most intense? In section 1 of the novel we read, this is Clarissa. Much rather would she have been one of those people like Richard, her husband, who did things for themselves. Whereas she thought, waiting to cross the street, half the time she did things not simply, not for themselves, but to make people think this or that. Perfect idiocy, she knew. And now the policeman held up his hand, for no one was ever for a second taking it. Oh, if she could have had her life over again, she thought, stepping onto the pavement. It could have looked even differently. She would have been, in the first place, dark, like Lady Bexborough, with the skin of crumpled leather and beautiful eyes. She would have been, like Lady Bexborough, slow and stately, rather large, interested in politics like a man, with a country house, very dignified, very sincere. Instead of which, she had a narrow, pieced figure, a little ridiculous face, beaked like a bird's. That she held herself well was true, and had nice hands and feet, and dressed well, considering that she spent little. But often now, this body she wore, she stopped to look at a Dutch picture. This body, with all its capacities, seemed nothing. Nothing at all. She had the oddest sense of being herself invisible, unseen, unknown. There being no more marrying, no more having children now, but only this astonishing and rather solemn progress with the rest of them up Bond Street, this being Mrs. Dalloway, not even Clarissa anymore, this being Mrs. Richard Dalloway. In a book published last year, Living a Feminist Life, which may be familiar to some students in the room, Sarah Ahmed quotes this exact passage and elaborates the following meditation. Mrs. Dalloway, she is busy, she's occupied. But she too can be distracted by what she encounters, looking up, not forward. Distraction is how she is thrown into a common world, thrown off her track, her purpose. Suddenly, in the middle of her day, when she is immersed in what she is doing, she has another sense of herself. She becomes aware of her own body as what she is wearing. This being Mrs. Richard Dalloway, in becoming wife, she loses herself. When it is no more, she is no more. No more marrying, no more having children now. Becoming woman, being no more. Becoming Mrs. Dalloway is a form of disappearance. To follow the paths of life is to feel that what is before you is a kind of astonishing and rather solemn progress. You are just going the same way others are going, she continues. She is walking with others when she catches sight of her own disappearance. We learn with Mrs. Dalloway how life itself can be understood as a path or a trajectory. There are points you should reach, points that become like punctuation, how we stop and start, how we measure our progression. We proceed in a direction through reaching certain points. A path gives life a certain shape, a direction, a sequence, a series of gig lamps, birth, childhood, adolescence, marriage, reproduction, death. How we begin, how we end, what happens along. We might sense how a life has a shape when it loses shape. Think of how Mrs. Dalloway comes to apprehend her own life as if it is a stranger's life. She becomes aware of becoming Mrs. Dalloway as an inevitable and solemn progress toward a point she has already reached. The shape of a life can feel like a past tense, something we sense only after it has been acquired. But we might also know this: we can leave a life. It is not too late to leave a life. Moments done. Though Ahmed does not address the form of the novel here, or at least not explicitly, or Woolf's experiment in narrative perspective, Woolf's tunneling process, her beautiful and intersecting caves that she digs out behind Clarissa and Septimus and others, this insightful gloss on the feminist resources in Mrs. Dalloway suggests a powerful correspondence between the formal dynamics that emphasize the complexity of inner life and one classic truism of second wave feminist activism: the personal is political. Indeed, we can elaborate. A walk to buy flowers is, in a sense, political, radically imbricated with the tendrils of a social system and its institutions as the aftershocks as well as the aftershocks of a recently concluded war that travel through the same tunnels cut out by the chimes of Big Ben. The path Larissa takes to Bond Street and the grooves that the narrator cuts between past and present, reality and reverie, life and death, are far from the hermetically sealed modernist mechanisms Hutchin adequates to modernist art. For they navigate networks of power relations to which the novel is intensely sensitive, as the hand of the policeman and later the judgment of Dr. Bradshaw illustrate. Even the very title, Mrs. Dalloway, so provincial and seemingly benign, becomes politically charged by this passage. And it is difficult not to think that Woolf's decision to change the name of the novel from The Hours to Mrs. Dalloway emphasizes the political and critical dimension of the novel rather than its formal ones. Inner life, solitude, the personal, the small, the everyday, the private. For decades, these Woolfian categories meant either the dismissal of her writing, as far less impressive, say, than the internationalism of James Joyce or Ezra Pound, or the depoliticizing of her writing, which Hutchin's work is complicit in perpetuating. Let us not take for granted, Woolf warns, that life exists more fully in what is commonly thought big than in what is commonly thought small. To take Woolf seriously as a writer whose modernism is not asocial, or ahistorical, or apolitical, might not require a rethinking of postmodernism, but it should, I think, encourage us to finesse our use of literary historical categories. To admit that where we insist upon a break or a key difference, we might be missing the important resonances and continuities. Also, when we invest in a model of literary history, especially modern, postmodern history, predicated on an economy, John Barth's economy, of exhaustion and replenishment, whose economy are we talking about? Male writers who see themselves as post-Joycean, no doubt, I've studied them, have expressed a kind of creative anxiety of what to do after Ulysses and Finnegan's Wake. But what about writers who see themselves as post-Woolfian, or who have, in their academic careers, studied Woolf? Funny that Jeanette Winterson and Toni Morrison have never seemed at a loss for what or how to write. Thank you.